Hello and welcome back to Highway to Hoover, a production of SEC Extra over at D1Baseball.com. I'm your host, Joe Healy, joined as always by my good friend and co-host, Mark Etheridge. We are going to one last time recap 2023. And by this, we don't just mean the 2023 season. We're talking about the entire calendar year. Most of what we'll talk about today actually happened in season, but there is some bigger picture stuff and off-field stuff and whatnot. We're going to count down excuse me, what we believe to be the 10 biggest stories in SEC baseball this year. I've got my list of 10. Mark has his list of 10. We will go through them. By the end of the episode, we'll have gone through both at some length. We'll see where we agree. We'll see where we disagree. We will also see what things got left off, because there are plenty of those. Mark and I both combed over a list earlier this afternoon as we record this, and I'm sure you feel the same way, Mark. I left a lot of things off that honestly, I assumed when I read them that were going to be on my list. So that'll be as interesting as anything else for us to go over.
Cut day was tough.
Yes. Cut day was really a lot of hard decisions from the personnel director on that.
Dang roster limits.
That's right. Before we get to that, though, a couple things. First, I have to let you know that this episode of Highway to Hoover and every episode of Highway to Hoover is brought to you by PitchLogic, the system used by players, coaches, scouts, and instructors at all levels of play, from youth leagues to the big leagues. The easy-to-use and affordable technology makes the platform accessible to every player at every level. All the metrics and features used at the highest level of our sport. See pitchlogic.com for more information. The other thing I need to get to before we get started, Mark, is that as listeners are listening to this, we are in that wonky week in the calendar between Christmas and New Year's. Yeah. Whoever decided on this calendar needs to get out of town. We need to spread things out a little more. But I don't think that's changing anytime soon. But we are going to talk a little bit about Christmas, Mark. Do you remember as a kid, do you remember the best Christmas gift you ever got?
Oh, you put me on the spot here.
I tell you what, I can go while you marinate on that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I was 6 or 7 years old. I think 7. Yes, 7. When Power Rangers was coming over to the U.S. and was a big thing. And I had one, the Christmas when I was 7, basically every gift I got was Power Rangers related.
Yeah.
And the single best gift I got was this giant, basically I got all the individual Power Rangers, because Mark, I know you're a Power Rangers expert, so you know this, but just for the audience, the Power Rangers would morph into animals or beings. They weren't all animals, I guess. Some were dinosaurs and whatnot. Maybe they were all dinosaurs. I don't really remember, but regardless. And then basically I got all those individual toys, and you could connect them together to make their boss, basically, that they combined to become. And that was just I was just blown away. I just remember being so excited. It was just blown away. I never expected to get all of those individual action figures, and I could put them all together and do the whole bit. So I also got tickets to the Power Rangers live show
you were
that year for Christmas.
Yeah.
Oh man. So my dad and I'm sure my dad loved doing
Bless
this.
him.
My dad took me down to the Compact Center. Actually, at that time, they probably called it still the Summit. It was where the Rockets played at the time. It was the Summit, and it was the Compact Center, and now it's owned by, I believe, Lakewood Church in Houston. This is before the Toyota Center existed, but my dad took me on down there, good sport that he was, and we went to the Power Rangers on stage. So that was my 1995 Christmas that really stands out. So Mark, in my Power Rangers filibustering, what did you come up with?
Well, I mean, it's not really that dissimilar, other than the genres are different, but I got a Millennium Falcon.
Ooh, heck yeah.
This was, from Star Wars, Han Solo's ship, right? And it was, obviously it's not that big, but it's it's pretty good size, big enough to put your action figures in it, which was the most important thing.
Yeah.
Because I had, all of the action figures, and had doubles of a lot of them. And, you could put Han Solo in the cockpit, and Chewbacca, and, all your droids and everything else. And then you had to be really careful, because if you drop it, it would probably not hold up real well. But you could fly it around really carefully and not drop it, because mom was watching. So But that was an awesome gift, and that was one of those that, came to mind pretty quickly. And I think I can remember one year. I must have been a tiny little guy. I got you will appreciate this being, from the Houston area. I got a Houston Oilers football helmet. And I don't really remember why I got a Houston Oilers football helmet, but I got one. And I would wear it around, and it became, basically part of my identity for, the period of time after Christmas until, you decided to play with Star Wars figures or something. But, it was just kind of one of those things that it's a distinct memory of running around. And, in those days, the face masks were like 2 bars going across, right?
Yeah.
And I had that. It was, and it was glorious.
Running around the house like a young Dan Pastorini.
There you go. Kenny the Snake Stabler. Maybe that was what it was. He's from down my area of the world.
Stabler smoking a heater on the sideline in between drives.
There you go, buddy. Don't mess with the snake.
Just like God intended. That was by the way, that was I think folks listening, they not only know I'm from Houston, I've mentioned the Oilers on a couple of occasions. And what happened last weekend where the Titans are wearing the Oilers uniforms? I'm not the first person to say this. An absolute travesty. What are we even doing?
That, huh? Yeah.
No, I didn't like that at all. Like, first of all, it's stolen valor. We can agree on that. But also, I feel like it should exist kind of like how technically the Ravens are the extension of the Cleveland Browns franchise, but the Browns came back and got their history, right? Mm-hmm. This is a little different because the Texans were an expansion franchise, but they weren't operating on the same name, right? They didn't come back as the Oilers. So it's a little different, but still, like, that's Houston's history. And so ultimately it doesn't matter, like, whatever. I still grew up an Oilers fan. I still remember watching Steve McNair, play in the Astrodome. Like, that doesn't change, but it is just kind of a bummer that the team that plays in Houston doesn't get to wear those throwback uniforms. So that's a bummer. And I'm not alone on that. I feel emboldened because I saw a lot of people on social media complaining about the same thing a couple of weekends ago when they played that game against each other. So
you got to admit, those jerseys are sweet.
Oh, they're so good. So good. Like, I like seeing them. I just wish they were being worn by the team that plays its football in Houston, but nothing is sacred. So every day we get further and further away from God, Mark. We just All right. On that note, let's move to our review of SEC baseball in the year 2023. So here's the format we're going to do for tonight to really, frankly, avoid a situation where you, the listener, has to listen to us just kind of ping pong back and forth and repeat each other and all that. What we're going to do is I will be in the driver's seat. I will go down my list of top 10 and we'll go one at a time. I'm not going to rattle the whole thing off, but and then I'll read off a number 10, for example. Then Mark will
opine,
basically say whether or not he has that number on his list. If he does, he'll tell us where it is. If not, he can just kind of react to it, and then we'll keep going. And then once we get to the end, we'll do a little compare and contrast. Mark will share which ones I didn't have that he had. And then we'll talk obviously about the ones neither of us had, because there are a lot of good ones out there that neither of us have. So without further ado, let's get to it. My number 10, the top stories in SEC baseball this year, Wes Johnson hired at Georgia. And spoiler alert, this is actually of the 3 new hires in the conference, this is the only one that I have. And I put it on the list, and it is at number 10, so it's right there. Because it is Wes Johnson. He's a guy who we've kind of wondered, the college baseball populace, if you will, has kind of wondered for a long time, what's going to be his first head coaching gig? Because I think we all knew as long as he was in college baseball, he was eventually going to be a head coach. And so you add the fact that, hey, this is a guy with MLB pitching coach experience. This is a guy with high-level pitching coach experience at, several SEC places, coming off winning a national title at LSU as a pitching coach. Just a lot of anticipation as to what he would do. Yes, exactly. It would be hard for a first-time head coach to be more qualified than he is in the role. So the fact that he chose Georgia, I think, you can only take the opportunities that are presented. But we've all sat here and wondered, like, man, if Georgia could really just get rolling. I mean, football and baseball are very different. I get it, but we see what the football program has done with a head coach that clearly is operating the program at a high level. But we've all kind of waited for something similar to happen in baseball with Georgia. And I'm not saying it will or won't, but the fact that Wes Johnson kind of saw that also and saw the potential there and took that job, I think speaks to what he thinks of it. And I'm just kind of interested to see how it ultimately plays out. So, did you have that one, Mark?
I did not.
Okay.
And it was one of those, it was, just beyond the cut line. It was considered. I think that the big thought for me was Wes has just been so, I guess, associated with pitching that you wondered if he wanted to be a head coach, right? Or did he just want to be a pitching teacher and make a lot of money? And
yeah, I mean, you make a good living doing that.
Work with really talented players at some of the best programs in the country, and just be cool with that, right? And you know, that's a nice problem to have, right? To be so sought after that you can get pretty much any pitching coach job and make it, 7-figure salary doing that, right? So I think so it was a bit of a surprise when he was the name floated, as that Georgia was looking at heavily, and then all of a sudden, boom, it happened. So yeah, I do think that, certainly he's qualified. Certainly he's got some different experiences compared to a lot of the head coaches because of his major league pedigree. So, it's very, it'll be interesting to see what he can do in year one, but I guess more importantly, will he be able to draw in either through the prep ranks or the portal pitchers who just want to work with a big league pitching coach, because he was a successful one.
Yeah, absolutely. So that will be interesting to monitor, sure, 2024, but really 2025 and beyond, we'll start to really get a feel for that. Okay, at number 9, I have Kentucky's super regional run. One of the things we love about this sport is that stuff just happens every year that, hey, didn't see that coming. And so there are multiple layers here. It's that, Kentucky got off to that hot start against a pretty good non-conference schedule. It was a lot of mid-majors, but they were all good mid-major programs. So they got off to that hot start and they just kind of kept winning. Then they got off to a hot start in SEC play. And it was like, okay, we're going to have to start taking this team seriously. And then it was clear the RPI was going to stick around. And then not only do they host, they win that regional in dramatic fashion. They go to a super regional, and had they not drawn LSU, who knows how it could have gone. And of course, after the season, Nick Mingione signs a new contract. It kind of feels like, okay, we can kind of, as a staff, that coaching staff feels like, all right, we can exhale for a minute, because let's be real, there was a lot of pressure going into last season for that staff. And I don't think, we're adults here. We can acknowledge that. So it kind of feels like, all right, we can exhale. We can just keep on plugging away. We've proved that we can do it here. Let's get back to work. And so that whole story, though, just kind of came, I don't want to say out of nowhere, but yeah, honestly, yeah, kind of out of nowhere, frankly. And it was cool to follow that story and to have something surprise us, because so often with this sport, we've kind of become accustomed to, we know the hierarchies. And so the idea that we could be surprised that way was delightful. So Mark, do you have that or any sort of Kentucky related item on your list?
I do. And, it's sort of a subset of what you're talking about. And it's at my number 9, actually, to match yours. It's Kentucky's RPI Renaissance. Because, I'm nerdy like that, but to be able to go through and see what they did, building the schedule and being able to not only build the schedule, but having it play out so that they have the premium RPI and then get rewarded for that, by hosting a regional and then winning that regional, right? So it's those best laid plans, often don't work out. And this time it did. And you got to tip your cap to someone who understood the game and played it and was able to have it have it work in their favor. So I think that was interesting because not only, for that all to transpire the way it did, but that no one has done that really in the SEC. Obviously, the Indiana States and Dallas Baptist, and there have been others, have played scheduling, I guess, jump through hoops a little bit to get to where they wanted to go from an RPI perspective, but no one in the SEC had done that. And Kentucky was a program that had been on the outside looking in multiple times, just a little bit, maybe one win away or 2 wins away, or more accurately, 5 to 10, 15 RPI points away. And that's what was addressed with the strategy, and it paid off in spades. So that for me was one of the bigger stories of 2023, and it'll be interesting to see, how that transpires going forward. How people build schedules, and if it becomes, this one-off thing that gets brought up in a show like this, or if it becomes kind of the norm.
Yeah, I think that's one of the other things that makes what they did last season so interesting is it feels like it's either going to be 5 years from now, we're going to look at it as a little bit of an outlier because, hey, their schedule broke just right. And we talked about this on last week's episode that, all the mid-major teams they played, they needed to be good, were good. And so things just kind of broke right for them in that way. Or we're going to look at it. The other option I think is that we're going to look at it as like the start of this kind of new edition of Kentucky baseball that's a little more consistently in the postseason discussion, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it kind of goes one of those two ways when we look back a few years from now. So that'll be interesting to see. All right, the number 8 on my list is what I call the Great Tennessee rotation shakeup. Specifically, Andrew Lindsay moves to the rotation. Chase Burns moves to the bullpen. And when this happened, it was like a meteor hitting Earth. I mean, that's extreme, but it was big news that the weekend where Tony Vitello said like, hey, we're just going into we're going to start Andrew Lindsay on Friday and then it's TBD the next 2 days. Right. And to that point, Tennessee was good, not great. They were kind of floundering a little bit in SEC play, and Burns was struggling, and Dolander was fine, but not great. And Beam was kind of himself, frankly. But and then we like Andrew Lindsay, like we're going with Andrew Lindsay on Friday, and it worked out great. Obviously, Lindsay really steadied the rotation. He was a solid guy. Was a big piece in them getting to Omaha. Chase Burns was electric out of the bullpen. That was a positive move there, and it feels like at the risk of maybe overstating it a little. But maybe not. That felt like it turned their season around totally. I mean, that was a team that was trending kind of in a bad direction at that point, and you thought, hey, there's a real chance this team maybe doesn't make a regional. It never felt like it was going to come to that, but we started to, you and I remember having started to have the discussion about, hey, the math is starting to get kind of difficult for this team.
They were 6-12.
Yeah. It's really starting to get like a little dicey here. And the second half of SEC play, the back 40%, if you will, went a lot better, and they got to Omaha. Right. So a lot of things had to go into that, but it felt like that was the biggest piece of the puzzle they figured out.
That I did not have that one, but that was very interesting. And I think the other part of that is, did that decision cost them Chase Burns, right, who left in the transfer portal during the summer?
Yeah.
So, you got to do what you got to do, and if people want to leave, they don't want to be part of your program, you just wish them the best and win with the guys you got, right? You got to do what's best for you. But that is part of the algebra as you make that decision.
Yeah. And I think, obviously I'm sure Tennessee would have loved to keep a pitcher around the talent of Chase Burns. But on the other hand, it's like, hey, we did what we had to do when we got to Omaha, and that's probably a trade-off they'll make. If it cost them Chase Burns, then that's kind of the cost of doing business, I guess.
One player versus the program, right?
Right. In some regards. So moving on, number 7. And this will allude a little bit to, I'm sure, something you as listeners assume we will talk about a little bit later. But number 7 is Alabama's postseason push after Brad Bohannon's firing. We didn't know which way that was going to go. You and I talked on several different podcasts about, hey, this this feels like the beginning of the end for Alabama, or maybe this frees them up to just be like, you know what, we're just going to go out here and play for ourselves and play for each other, and just nobody has any expectations. And it was really the latter. The team, and for those who, I think it's easy to forget now, they were kind of that team early in the SEC season where it was like, yeah, I think this team is good. They just can't win series. They were going 1-2 every weekend. And in hindsight, the fact that they were going 1-2 ended up being helpful. Not getting swept was a big part of the equation for them. Right. The second half of SEC play, they started to win those series, right? And so they end up hosting, which is a big deal. And they end up winning that regional. And much like Kentucky, their reward was playing Wake Forest, which was probably never going to go great. So Wake Forest in Winston-Salem in particular. So, that just played out that way, but it doesn't take anything away from what that team did and finding it within themselves to pull together an older team. And I think that played a role, an older team coming together to do something pretty cool and pretty special. And one of my personal favorite stories from last season.
Yeah. I have that one, and it's much higher for me because it's paired with another one that I'm sure we'll both talk about.
We'll get to that.
Yeah. But yeah, it was just I guess just a surprising story because of, obviously with the way everything went down there, and then being able to, I guess, right the ship and figure out the right way to move forward with this, and to get where they did, where you not only were able to host a regional but won the dang thing. I mean, at the end of the year, I mean, they were one of the most, that they looked like an Omaha club. They just ran into Wake, right? And I think it's kind of one of those things you often wonder with teams that are just so close and they need some sort of catalyst, right, to get them moving in the right direction. Obviously, this one was a unique one, but that for me was just such a shock, right? Because they were a team that they had talent. I mean, we had them ranked in the top 25 preseason, but they looked like another club that was going to be a bubble club, right? They were going to maybe on the outside, and they were able to figure it out, under the weirdest circumstances maybe ever, in the modern history of our sport. So for me, that was actually the third story that of 2023 for me.
Yeah, totally fair. Could have easily been higher on my list.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just a really talk about things that could have never anticipated on so many levels, right? So, okay, number 6 on my list, Mississippi State struggles again. Just a team that coming off a tough year last year. You and I going into the 2023 season. I know I'll just speak for myself. I personally uttered the phrase, Mississippi State will be better in 2023. It's just a matter of how much better. And like, I guess you could make the argument they were marginally better. Right. They were certainly a little more competitive and exciting, right?
And at the end of the year, they were pretty good. They just,
they were coming around a little bit. Right. They started to figure some things out. They got a little healthier, right? Cade Smith came back and was pretty good. And Aaron Nixon came back and was pretty, and Dakota Jordan took off. There were a lot of things that played into it, and oh, by the way, if you're a State fan and you're looking for reasons for optimism, you might start there with okay, we sort of, not all those guys are back, but we, started to feel good about things a little bit. So there's that. But I just think it seemed unfathomable going into last year that this kind of thing would happen again. And they missed Hoover again for the second year in a row. And that's just not something that, State is not immune to the occasional stinker of a season. Like if you look back through their year by year, they have those every once in a while. But having 2 in a row is really unlike that program. And 2024 is going to be an important year for that program, an important year for Chris Lemonis and his staff. And so again, you look at it and you're like, man, could it happen 3 years in a row? But we didn't think it would happen 2 years in a row. And here we are. So State struggling to the degree they did, missing Hoover again is my number 6 story in the SEC for 2023.
And I have that. That's my number 8, and it was really interesting because even though they struggled, I mean, I was at that Super Bulldog weekend where they set the attendance record. I mean, the fans were games still mattered.
Oh, and there was a shocking amount of people in that stadium
Yeah,
late in the year still.
people
Yeah, I
still
mean,
believed, right? And they played Arkansas really well at the end of the year, and A&M and all these different teams, and they didn't give up, right? They still fought. They just, they were in such a big hole that they just couldn't dig out of it. But yeah, that for me was certainly, with all of the advantages that program has, incredible ballpark, incredible support. You expect better, and I think this year, it's you were a little bit better from 22 to 23. I think this year they got to be a regional club, and I think the talent's there for that to happen. And it's just a question of, are we going to be right or wrong, right, when we evaluate this club?
Yeah, I mean the beauty and the pain of SEC baseball is that, I mean, really, even as much as they struggled last year, they're basically 2 or 3 wins away from being right back in that discussion. So,
Yeah.
But on the flip side, you lose a couple games and suddenly the math is bad for you. So that's just the way it kind of works on a razor's edge. Number 5 on my list is Ole Miss finishing last in the league.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one that, look, as surprised as we were that Mississippi State struggled the way they did again, at least you could look at it and say, well, they were bad in 2022, and how much better do we think this team was going to be? So at least you could point at that and say, like, look, maybe we should have seen that coming a little bit. With Ole Miss, though, I mean, they were coming off national title, which I know is not, because of state, is not a unique situation to be in where you stumble the next year, but they had superstars on offense at Ole Miss, and they did on paper great in the portal. And I went to Oxford and I saw them win a series against a very good Maryland team, and they crushed the ball all over the field. And the pitching had problems, but we kind of thought, okay, like LSU's pitching had problems too, right?
Yeah.
They're young, and and it just really got sideways on them in a big, big way. And I truly, I don't know that I've actually, somebody like Chase Parham or somebody could do a good autopsy on that for us, because that poor guy saw more Ole Miss baseball last year than a physician would probably recommend. But
poor Chase,
given how the season went, but I really don't think I've fully gone back and done the autopsy on, like, I understand the broad strokes of it, right? The pitching wasn't good. The younger pitchers didn't quite make the progression that you would have wanted to see from them. Some of the offense kind of tailed off as SEC play got underway. Some of those transfers that came out of the gate really hot pulled back a little bit, but I still don't totally understand how it happened. It's one of those where I look at that talent, at least with State, it's like, yeah, I mean, they were kind of banking on a lot of guys without track record, but with Ole Miss, it was like, man, they got a lot of guys who know what they're doing out here. And how did this not go better, right? Last place? Like, what are we doing here? So that one really kind of came out of left field for me, and it's why it is number 5 on my list of the top stories for SEC in 2023.
Yeah, it's on my list too. It was number 10. And really, I think it boiled down to just not having enough depth in the lineup, depth in the pitching staff. There were just guys, the top few seemed to come through okay. It's just that next group didn't get it done to compete at this level. And it kind of reminds me of something that we talked about during late last year when we were trying to evaluate, certain, like Ole Miss, who was last place in the SEC versus other teams and other leagues. Where would Ole Miss be if they didn't get their eyes beat out by the, LSU and, Auburn and, Florida and all these teams every week? If they had a chance just to kind of have some success and breathe for a week and not have that gauntlet week after week, would they have been able to get some confidence and kind of right the ship, right? And but because of who they are and where they play every week, that opportunity wasn't afforded to them, and they just never. That once that car started fishtailing, they were in the ditch and they just couldn't get out.
Such is life. We say it. We say it all the time. Such is life in the SEC. It's real easy to get rolled over if you, it's like when you're running I don't do this kind of thing, but I know you do, Mark, or have in your past at least. When you're running like a distance run, and you're in one of those tight packs, and if someone falls down, everyone falls down. Like that's kind of what playing baseball in the SEC is like. It's like you have a bad weekend, or you get a couple guys hurt, and all of a sudden you're just like at the bottom of a pile and you can't get out. Like it's kind of what it's like.
Yeah, I mean, you got to run the mile you're in, right? You got to focus on where you are, or else you're gonna you can't finish the last mile, when you're in mile 3.
The one time I tried to do any sort of distance run, I came away with a stress reaction in my foot, and I decided that was the end of my running career.
Yeah,
so,
you didn't train properly, Joe.
And I wore old shoes.
Yeah.
In my defense, like my girlfriend at the time wanted to do it, and I was like, yeah, okay, I'll do it. And so I just laced up my crappy old like sneakers that I was playing like pick up basketball in, and just took off to go run. And I stress reaction and had to wear a soft boot on my foot for 6 weeks. Sucks. It wasn't a lot of fun.
Sucks.
Moving on. Number 4, Jack Caglione announces himself as a potential first overall pick in 2024. Look, I think we saw flashes in 2022, right? Mm-hmm. So Caglione didn't pitch in 2022 due to injury, but he hit kind of towards the end of the year, and it was like he was like a lightning bolt of electricity kind of through that Florida lineup when he came back. And then you started to hear stuff leading up to in the fall and leading up to last season where people were like, hey, this guy is the real deal. Like this guy's a guy. And then sure enough, I mean, look, were there issues on the mound? Sure. But I mean, the number of guys who can do the stuff that he does, that has the tools he has, most of those guys are in the big leagues, and it might just be one dude who just signed a $700 million contract.
Yeah.
Right. He is a one of one, and that's why he might be 1-1, if you will. How about that for a play on words?
There you go.
I don't think I need to say anything else there. I mean, he's just I mean, the best two-way guy in the country, and it's not close. Also just a different two-way guy than we've seen a lot of, right? I mean, like we used to kind of fawn over Brendan McKay's two-way ability, and we kind of talked a little bit about like, hey, is he a hitter or is he a pitcher? But he wasn't the hitter that Jack Caglione is. His stuff isn't as good as Jack Caglione's is. AJ Reed was a very successful two-way player at Kentucky. He wasn't any kind of pitcher like Jack Caglione is. He had power, but he's not as complete a hitter as Jack Caglione is, right? So he's just so different from anything we've seen. And there are other guys that I've heard their names out there for potential first overall pick. I mean, I like Travis Bazzana as a player, but I don't see how you pass up Cags as first overall pick in 2024.
I don't either, man.
I mean, let's not overthink this. That's kind of where I'm at.
Because you try him, as a pitcher or as a hitter. I don't care, whichever one you like the most. And if it doesn't work, you got a really good fallback opportunity where with the other guys you don't.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that, and maybe he can do both. And he's on my list, right? This is number 6 for me. And offensively, he was, it just sounds different when you don't even have to look, right? They're taking BP and you hear something and you go, oh, I know who's batting, right? It's just kind of one of those things that, you do this a long time and you don't see or you don't hear a lot of at bats like this. So I think the other thing I'll point out here is, since it is still 2023, I saw him this fall, and I know it was just one day, but he's better. Okay. So he threw more strikes. In fact, he threw almost all strikes in the limited action that I saw him. And, he didn't strike out at the plate, he was uber aggressive last year, and he had a hit to all 3 fields. Right. So this is a guy who's maturing, who missed time with Tommy John, who didn't really bat much his first year. He came in, towards the end of the year, and then he's had one full year. And like with anything, you're so much better at something the second time through than you were the first time. And I just think, he's poised for that big jump, and it couldn't come at a perfect time or a better time for him because this is draft year. And I think, if he gets anything to hit, he's going to have a big year. And I think he's going to pitch better. He's going to pitch on Sundays, so you don't mess up his first base playing ability the first 2 days. So people are going to look at him and go, why is, he's arguably the best pitcher in the sport and he's not pitching on Fridays. Well, that's by design. But I think he's poised, for 2024 to have an even bigger year than he had in 2023, if that's even possible.
And boy, other SEC clubs hope that's not the case, but man, it sure would be fun. And I mean, and you're right about just watching him swing. I've seen a lot of BP at Charles Schwab Field in Omaha the last 5 years that I've been going. And I mean, he's like hitting backspin line drives out of the stadium. Like it's just nuts. It really is.
It's video game stuff.
Right? Yeah. Like it's incredible. Okay. My number 3 on the list is Paul Skeens and Dylan Cruz going 1 and 2. And just the SEC success in the draft more generally, but focusing on the 1 and 2 part of that, I mean, that's an unprecedented thing. It shows the type of talent that LSU collected and kind of a celebration of 2 guys that were really special to college baseball. I mean, one is that Paul Skeens was just a supernova last year.
Yeah.
Like really never got, I mean, the one start you could maybe nitpick is the South Carolina one, but there was weather and it was a weird deal. But every week you could just set your watch to it. Like he was just going to go out there and basically dominate. And okay, they might score a run or two, and I guess maybe the Kentucky start, like Kentucky got him more than a lot of teams did, but
he had such a big lead.
Yeah. For the most part, he just went out there and shoved every week. And he was exactly that guy all the way through the postseason and put up one of the, when you consider the modern offensive environment, I mean, it's Mark Pryor type numbers, right? When Pryor was around in 2001. That's on the level of that. And then Cruz, I mean, here's a guy who from the minute he stepped on LSU's campus, it was pretty clear like, oh, this guy shouldn't be here. He should be in pro ball, and really from the minute he jumped on campus, also people were like, yeah, there's our first overall pick in 2023. Right. And had Skeens not fallen out of the sky, basically, and that's not an Air Force pun, but had Skeens not just appeared on the scene and been the guy he would have been the first overall pick. And that's pretty unique to have a guy who from the minute he steps on campus, just be like, well, there's a first overall pick. And then he is that, right. Yeah. And puts up the numbers that he did. Cause he was excellent every single year he was on campus. So,
and I'll be shocked if he's not in the bigs next year.
Oh yeah. I mean, this whole class,
double-A, right.
Yeah, I mean, Wyatt Langford's season could have been an item on this list. Maybe it is for you, but I mean, that guy went into pro baseball basically as a big league hitter, so that this class in general is going to be pretty impressive when it's all said and done, I think. But Mark, I assume you had that one on your list.
Well, I had basically how dominant Skeens was, and I also had Cruz, taking player of the year and just how good he was. And we can talk a little bit about both. You covered a lot of it, but I think for me is, I saw Skeens opening day and I came away, I think Kendall texts me and goes, what'd you think of LSU the first day? And I'm like, Paul Skeens might have looked as good as anybody I can remember watching. And he's like, really? I'm like, because he knows how great my hair is, and I'm thinking, yeah, he was just so dominant, and a lot of people are dominant opening day against less than stellar competition, and then they come back to earth, but he never did, and he just continued to get better and better and better as he progressed under Wes Johnson that we talked about, and the team that just continue to support him and allow him to succeed. And part of that team was Dylan Cruz. And if you recall, dude was hitting like 500 for most of the year. And we were actually, we had the 500 watch for a while, right? Where is he really going to do this? Dave Magadan, right?
Yeah, look out, Dave Magadan.
We're wondering, where he is and should he be worried? And instead, he's doing the Miami Dolphins undefeated season, popping the champagne or whatever, because nobody's going to break his record. But anyway, Cruz still had a magnificent year and was he's certainly a can't miss, big leaguer as is Skeens, of course. And the two of them together were just such a driving force in that year. And it would be really easy when you had these two competing guys trying to be the number one pick in the draft and trying to win all the National Player of the Year awards, to have bickering or have all this animosity back and forth, and that just never happened. It was all about the team, and if they won awards, cool, that's nice, we like that. But what we're really focused on is that final dog pile at the end of the year, and that's what they got. So for me, I mean, both of those were on my list, and I think that I had them separate, but I think them going 1-2 in the draft is just one more cherry on top of the great seasons that they had.
Speaking of those guys being more focused on the team aspect of it, my number 2 on the list is LSU winning the national title. It's first since 2009, and that in and of itself a big story, obviously. But beyond that, I think there's also the interesting piece. I know you're fascinated by this. I know it's something you are going to be writing about at some point here relatively soon. Is just that it kind of validated the roster building approach that Jay Johnson and his staff took. Because, I mean, look, there were a lot of people who gave the roster building some side eye because of assumptions made about, NIL or how those players were brought to LSU. And I'm not really, frankly, interested in either debating that or relitigating that, because I don't care, frankly. But regardless, there is an interesting piece where it's like, to your point, when you have a bunch of guys that talented on the same roster, how do they coexist? How do you manage that? And there were some bumps in the road. I mean, we talked a lot about LSU's pitching along the way, but they figured it out. Like, Jay managed those personalities, and they ended up winning a national title. And I think it's just, for all the people that thought that might end up being some sort of tire fire, especially when the pitching went sideways and the injuries started to pile up, but they managed it, and they lifted the trophy in the end.
Yeah, that was my number 1. I mean, the ability to take that team, which we anointed number 1 at the beginning of the year, and really go wire to wire. Okay. I think there was this little dip, and Wake Forest became number 1 for a week or two, and maybe Clemson at the end, right, was in that picture. But it was really LSU for 90% of the year. And then once the postseason started and they figured it out again, it was kind of LSU versus the field. And because they were the most talented team, and if they were able to, get out of their own way, they would, they'd have a great chance to beat anybody. And that's what they did. And that, to me, was the biggest story of the year, on the field anyway. And I think that's that's where I landed on that.
The number 1 story for me, I know you had this one on your list. I'm actually surprised a little bit that it wasn't also your number 1, but is the Brad Bohannon gambling scandal.
Yeah.
This was really the one college baseball story that penetrated to not just the general interest sports stuff. Like, it wasn't just that it was on SportsCenter or on the ESPN homepage or talked about on every sports radio program, not just in the SEC footprint, but nationwide. But also it was like general news, around the country. And that's pretty rare for college baseball. And unfortunately it was for something negative, but that makes it the biggest story for me this year in the SEC. Just that was such talk about things that just came down that were just like, wait, what? Like, what is happening here? For so many reasons. And look, there's still a lot of things that are interesting about that to me, that the fact that we still don't exactly have all the answers on what exactly transpired, other than the fact that he was on the phone with the gambler at the time, he being Brad Bohannon. Brad Bohannon has not spoken about it since then. We haven't heard from him at all. And it just, I don't want to say it went away, but just kind of like there hasn't really been a lot of movement in that story. And you just wonder if that just is going to be what it is. And that's totally fine. We don't need any more to the story. I don't think we're owed anything, but it is interesting that we haven't necessarily, that story hasn't progressed at all at this point. But it is, to me, it's undoubtedly the number 1 story, just from the standpoint of it was the story that broke through into the mainstream more than anything else this year.
Yeah, and I went number 2, and primarily because I just wanted to do something on the field first.
Yeah, that's.
But
I mean, it's totally fair.
yeah, but I mean, it was certainly the one that was most shocking and resonated, with those of us who knew who know Brad Bohannon. So, um, I think for me that it was certainly. I mean, Brad Bohannon is one of the nicest people you will ever meet. Okay, regardless of what all has happened, you know, that's unchanged. Okay, if you met him, you would like him. He's very charismatic, he's very articulate, he's a good communicator. All those things are still true, right? You can do things that people don't approve of and still have good traits. And I think sometimes we have to be all in or all out, right? So so that part has been, it's been kind of hard to reconcile how someone that you were that fond of, right, as a person, and have this happen to them. And it just goes to show that we're all infallible in ways that, that people make mistakes and people can make bad decisions, and boy, do they have consequences. And he found that out the hard way. And I mean, one of the first things that that I thought of when this happened is, if there was going to be a college coach who would be embroiled in a scandal, he would be one of the last people I would suspect, right? Not that I'm, thinking I've got my spreadsheet out with the ones most likely, right? That's
I was
not
going to
really one
say,
of these
but
parts.
without further ado, here are the top 5 coaches that we think would be embroiled.
That would be good radio, but
Yeah,
we're
the
not doing
listeners would
that
like
today.
that.
Yeah,
We'd get a lot of angry phone calls afterwards, though.
yeah, but it does goes to show, just kind of painting the picture of how shocking this news was to the people who, who'd been in contact with him. So, um, and then for that to happen, and for him to be subsequently dismissed, and then the team to go on this great run, right? It was just one of those stories that will live on and on. And unfortunately, he's the butt of this joke, and obviously he had some decisions that he shouldn't have made. Um, so now for him, it's, what's next, but for the rest of us, it's cautionary tale, right? On, you need to make good decisions. You need to be careful who you associate with, and everyone, especially within the gambling industry that's so pervasive in today's world, they're watching you. So you're not going to be able to get away with things that perhaps you could, years ago. So, that's, but it certainly was one of the biggest stories of college baseball in years, and obviously either the biggest or one of the biggest of last season.
So let's move to Mark. What do you have? So starting from the top
Yeah.
with 10, go down 10 to 1 and kind of run us through just kind of quickly. We don't have to jump too deep
Yeah.
into them, but the ones that you have that I did not.
There's only one, man.
Really? Okay.
And that is number 4, which is the SEC got half of the top 8. Had 4 of the top 8, national seeds, we'll call them that, and then 8 of the top 16 host sites, and then had an all SEC final. So it was certainly an SEC heavy postseason, that followed an SEC dominated regular season. It's certainly atop the polls, the RPI, and all of these different things. So, goes to show the strength of the league and how things are trending, and it's only going to get stronger, with realignment and how things are shifting. There are fewer leagues, more teams in each league, and a lot of the teams in the top leagues care about baseball. So you're going to have, an even greater probability of something like this happening again when you move to a 16-team SEC, because you're adding Oklahoma and Texas, who have either been to the World Series or even been to the to the final in the last 3 years. So I think that's, that was a big takeaway for me is showing the strength in how the committee values, or the current committee values the SEC strength and compared to everyone else. I mean, half of the top 8, half of the 16 is very significant.
Yeah, I mean, excuse me. That's a good point. I mean, maybe I should have had that on my list. There's part of me, I think the reason why I left it off was just because it feels like, yeah, okay, well, that's kind of what we're doing now.
But even that was even more than usual.
No, right? Agreed. Yeah. Totally agree. Yeah. Let's run through, Mark. I will rattle. Here's what we'll do. I will rattle through very quickly, like mostly everything else that we even debated for a second on our list. And then at the end, you pick out one or two that you think were kind of like your 11 or 12, and you could just kind of spitball it. So these are in no particular order. Texas A&M landing Braden Montgomery in the portal. Big deal there. Speaking of transfers, Colby Shelton transfers from Alabama to Florida. That's an SEC story on both ends. Tommy White living up to expectation. Like just given how much happened there was the kind of curiosity about, if he'd be able to live up to what everyone thought he would be. Rob Vaughn getting hired at Alabama. And, oh, by the way, holding on to Jason Jackson on the staff. Carrick Jackson being hired at Missouri. Nate Yeske moving from Texas A&M to LSU as the pitching coach. Vanderbilt winning the SEC tournament. Auburn's midseason turnaround. Wyatt Langford's monster season. Arkansas winning the SEC West and continuing to just figure it out year after year. Charlie Condon arrives out of nowhere. Justin Parker goes from South Carolina to Mississippi State as the pitching coach. South Carolina's injury woes derail what could have been a special season. Chase Burns transfers away from Tennessee, goes to Wake Forest. The loaded freshman class generally, I think, was a big story. Condon, Ethan Petrie, Jace Laviolette, Ike Irish, Cade Curlin, Colby Shelton. Tennessee's marathon win over Clemson in regionals. I think that's probably my favorite game involving an SEC club from last season. So that was a pretty long list, Mark. What are a couple that stand out to you that we did not have?
I think Auburn's midseason turnaround. They had the best record in the SEC for the second half of the year. After the first half, I would not have expected that, right? And certainly them, even though they didn't play that well in the regional, they hosted and had a great turnaround. I think Tennessee's win over Clemson, I think a lot of us felt that Tennessee was a very dangerous club.
Oh, yeah.
When they got into regional play, and if there was going to be an upset, they would be one of the likely contenders to do it. But Clemson had been playing so well. And those were two teams, that kind of met at the apex of their ability. And oh man, it was incredible theater. What was it? How many innings was it? Was it 14? Am I remembering?
14, I think. Yeah. And the difference in like Tennessee used, I don't have the box score, but like 4 or 5 pitchers, and Clemson used roughly 1,500.
Right.
Like it was very different ways to patch together 14 innings.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those were big. I think the other thing is Wyatt Langford, just how how well he played, how well he came back from a just grotesque injury and was able to get back in the lineup quickly and played well. And then once he moved to pro ball, just continued to do Wyatt Langford things, and was a AAA and was on the taxi squad or whatever you want to call it for the World Series, or if somebody would have been injured, he would have been there. That's a long, you're playing in the College World Series in June and this close from playing in the Big Boy World Series in October. What a year that guy had.
Yeah, that would have been. I'd be curious. Maybe a listener knows, but if anybody has ever done that, played in the College World Series, and certainly not in a long time. But there were guys who like Dave Winfield went straight from college to major league, the major leagues, and so I wonder if there's anyone who's ever done that. It wouldn't surprise me if someone back in the 50s or 60s did it, but
yeah. The route would be a relief pitcher, right? A guy who could just come in and get a couple of guys out. But yeah, that would have been really cool. I hadn't even really considered that, but yeah, that would have been
really, really cool year, and probably an extreme, like he probably got home and slept for 2 weeks after the season.
Yeah.
It's a long year considering, Florida spring practice started in January, and he has to stay game ready through the end of October. So
no doubt.
This was a fun exercise, kind of fun to revisit the whole year that was. So much of this we've talked about at length, but some of these things were things that we haven't talked about in a long time, or maybe got a little bit glossed over and lost in the sauce, if you will. So it was nice to be able to revisit some of this stuff. And now we kind of turn the page, as you're listening to this, we are about to enter 2024. We'll probably have a couple of episodes that are, I'd like to have some guests on. We've talked about that. But it really probably is only a couple of more episodes before we start to get into actual preseason team preview episodes of the podcast. So, boy, that is barreling down on us, but I'm excited. I'm excited to actually, we've talked a lot about last season. We've talked about what might happen, and look, preseason preview stuff is still talking about what might happen, but at least we'll have something a little more concrete to talk about, because we'll have these, projected lineups and rotations and all that stuff to kind of pour over. So I'm looking forward to that. That is going to do it for this edition, however, of the Highway to Hoover podcast, a production of SEC Extra over at d1baseball.com. Thank you to Pitch Logic for sponsoring this and every episode of the show. Thank you, Mark, as always. Thank you, the listener, for listening.